For getting on with it now.
All right,
we're going
to move on. Leave HS2 and other transport announcement for the moment because Greg Dawson has been talking to some residents in Manchester who have found themselves facing huge bills to make their buildings safe. Here's his film.
How are you trying to stay positive to sort of get yourself through this?
It's really hard to stay positive.
All that money that we invested, all that hard work that we put into making sure we had somewhere and we got out of being sort of generation rent has been futile, really. We're now generation trapped.
It just feels crazy that we've got to a point that that is our fire alarm system.
Over the last decade, Manchester has had an apartment boom, with many people taking their first steps onto the property ladder. But in the wake of changes to fire safety regulations after Grenfell, thousands in this city and across the country have discovered their homes are unsafe and their investment worthless. This is the Albion Works building, one of more than 30 developments in the city deemed unsafe. The main problems being this timber cladding and the fire alarm system. It's led to this: teams of fire wardens patrolling the blocks 24/7.
The first thing you do is shout, fire, fire, fire.
So you run around?
Yes, you run around, knock as many doors as possible, then tell them the fire point.
And how long have you guys been told that you need to do this for until the system gets fixed?
Oh, we've got no idea.
When I first came to the viewing, I just knew it was for me straight away.
Leanne bought her flat at Albion Works in 2017.
I cannot believe we are at a point where there are men walking around the building that are going to alert us of a fire. It feels terrifying when I lie in bed at night and I can hear their footsteps walking past my door. It's just a horrible feeling to have that.
To make matters worse, the cost of the patrol is being paid for by the flat owners, as well as the replacement to the cladding, which is expected to cost each leaseholder tens of thousands of pounds. Campaigners say residents here are the victims of a cladding lottery. If your cladding is aluminium composite material, or ACM, which was fitted to Grenfell Tower, the government will fund its removal. If it's not, the cost falls onto leaseholders. In a block adjacent to Leanne's, Matt Holsworth lives with his partner. They got married last year and were planning to move to a bigger home so they can start a family. They're alarmed at the scale of the quotes given to people in other affected buildings in the city.
People have been quoted 20, 30, 40,000 pounds. That is money we simply don't have. We'd be bankrupt, we'd be homeless, we'd have to sell.
How are you going to sell it?
We don't know. Yeah, we have no idea. Does it get taken from us? Does someone come round and kick us out? If this was a car and it was faulty, a company would recall it. And there is no way on earth they'd be expecting you, the customer, to foot the bill of that as well.
The people living here say what makes their situation even worse is the fact that they've been given no time frame whatsoever for when all of these problems will be remedied. They've got no idea what the final bill will be. And as far as they're concerned, they shouldn't have to pay a penny for mistakes made in the construction of their home, and they want the government to step in. So what about building owners, Artisan Investment? When we went to their website, we found it was down for maintenance. However, we did get a comment from them. The leaseholders have covenants within their lease, which outlines their obligation regarding the maintenance and repair of the building. We completely appreciate the concerns of the residents regarding the cost, whilst our priority is to ensure their safety based on the advice we receive. However, they refute any suggestion these issues relate to the quality of the build at the time of the construction, all of which complied with building regulations at the time of the build. The government says the fund to remove the cladding used for Grenfell Tower is exceptional because of the unparalleled risk of ACM cladding. However, they stress building owners should do all they can to protect leaseholders from costs.
It's absolutely ridiculous. I feel trapped in a building that's unsafe and I feel trapped financially. This was my first ever property. It was kind of my cocoon and where I felt safe. And now it just feels like a really scary place to be and somewhere I just don't want to be.
And we've been joined by Alex Di Giuseppe, who's a co-founder of the campaign group Manchester Gladiators. Now, you've been meeting with housing ministers today, haven't you? What was said?
Firstly, thank you for having me. We had a very in-depth discussion about what the plans on the table were going to be in order to fix this problem. They've obviously outlined that it's very complex, it's very challenging, and it's going to take a long time. They couldn't really say much more than that. And with that in mind, the Manchester Gladiators and other campaign groups around the country, in the run-up to the budget, will be making sure that it's pushed high up on the agenda of politicians, MPs and cabinet ministers.
What do you want them to do?
What we would like to do is, what we'd like the government to do is, they are the only people that can fix it, in our minds, essentially.
OK.
And there are 3 problems on the table at the moment. When I explain this, I kind of package them up. So we've got ACM cladding, which there is a fund for, which was on Grenfell. We've also got non-ACM cladding, which is the HPL, it's the timber stuff. There's no fund for that currently. And there's also general fire safety issues. So that's where buildings have been built and signed off, but they've not been built to specification. And there's no fund for that either.
Right. I mean, do you accept that leaseholders have signed covenants, and those covenants were signed at a time when the materials used to build these blocks were deemed safe? So isn't it the responsibility then of those leaseholders to pay for the costs?
I mean, you could argue that. I mean, essentially, that's what the covenants and leases say. But, I mean, when we read that, and that's, you know, I have the same in my lease. I read mine the other day. But it's to maintain and repair, essentially. What we're talking about now is obviously the fundamentals of a building. We're talking about the cladding on there. We're talking about the internal steel beams. We're talking about compartmentation, fire breaks, cavity barriers, things that haven't been built correctly.
But were they at the time when the materials were deemed safe?
This is a very interesting point, because they're signed off as being built, but when the reports are being done now, they're saying that retrospectively things haven't been signed off, that have been signed off but not correctly. And the bill's fate is coming on our head.
So isn't the question this, is that were those buildings built in accordance with the regulations?
Correct.
That's question number 1.
Yep.
And question number 2 is, if they were, and those regulations were insufficient, you buy it in good faith because you think, well, I must be buying a safe flat, but the regulations weren't good enough. And either way, it's either the builder's fault or the government's fault for not regulating, but the last person's fault it is yours.
Exactly.
Would you then say that the government, and if it was a Labour government, would foot the bill for this?
Well, I think that the lesson from Grenfell is that people shouldn't be living in buildings that could catch fire.
Right.
And it isn't just a partial lesson, ACM cladding, because that was the specific cladding from Grenfell.
On this, Emily, would you say that the government should foot the bill?
Yes, I think that what should happen is that people should be living in safe buildings.
Right. I mean, should leaseholders have to pay for this?
I think it is a complex issue. I'm very sympathetic to everything that was in your report and everything you've just said. I think we have got this fund for people who've got Grenfell-style cladding to help get rid of that and pay for that. That was a good thing to do. I can see the argument you're making for doing the same thing for other types of dangerous cladding, and the key is to get this stuff off as quickly as possible, as Emily says.
Absolutely.
But
on the other hand,
if you're involved in a fire, it doesn't matter whether it's ACM cladding or anybody else's cladding. If your flat's still on fire.
That's the key thing. But the one thing I would say is where there are large private sector landlords who could pay, if they can pay for it rather than the taxpayer, that's a good thing, because that is money we're not spending on the NHS or schools or whatever it would be.
And that's my question. That's something I want to raise with you, because it said, Robert Jenrick has come out in January and said building owners have responsibility to take action.
Yeah.
Why are they not being pushed to the absolute limit when we are living in buildings that are deemed unsafe?
I think this is a good point. So with the ACM cladding, the government have started naming and shaming landlords who are being too slow, and I think that's a good thing to do for your type of cladding as well.
I appreciate that, but obviously speed is key here. There could be a fire at any point, and this is,
no, it must be
I don't want to be sitting
scary.
here tomorrow talking about another Grenfell.
Absolutely.
So what is the delay? What can I do to push? Because me and the Manchester Gladiators are going to be banging this drum for until the budget and beyond. When we get to June, that's going to be a 3-year anniversary of Grenfell.
It's a very important campaign. It's good that ministers are meeting you. It's clear that they are thinking seriously about this. And issue number 1 is who's going to pay? Is it going to be the private landlords, or to what extent is it the government going to pay? And the really big number 1 issue is how can we make this happen more quickly? And the fund for the Grenfell-style cladding it's good that we've either got it off or getting it off every single bit of council block. Same for the private sector blocks. And then we've now got to crack on with all these other types of cladding as well. So I think you're making a strong case, but where there are private landlords who can pay, It is money you're saving for other important public services.
Do you think the government should be now agreeing to push those private landlords, compel them?
Yeah, definitely. It's their
not
responsibility.
just ACM cladding, but non-ACM cladding.
I want to see ministers, as they have with the other Grenfell-style cladding, standing up in the House of Commons and naming and shaming people who are just not getting on with it.
More than naming and shaming them. Naming and shaming them is not enough. If these are private landlords, or they're the freeholder of a building that is not safe, it doesn't matter what sort of cladding they have. If there's a fire and the fire can decimate the whole building, then the landlord has a responsibility to ensure that that cladding is taken off.
Legally true already.
Yeah, but if it's not happening 3 years on, then the government has to step in. Christian? It has to be proactive.
It seems absolutely outrageous, and reading around some of your fellow campaigners, hear about people who bought their first property, have tried to remortgage and been told that actually because of the cladding their property value is zero. On the point about who owns the property, I mean, I don't know about all of the examples, but many of these kind of developments will be owned ultimately by quite large-scale institutional investors, many by foreign, particularly Asian investors. Now, on the one hand, that does make it complicated to trace back and go through and find exactly who has to do what. On the other hand, it stands out that these are institutions very often absolutely could pay for this. They have a responsibility. It comes with the ownership. It comes with the revenue they're generating from the asset. And this is an investable asset class. So there absolutely is a responsibility on people who own these buildings.
But the Manchester Gladiators can't take on these huge, great international investors on their own.
Absolutely need
government support.
And on that, obviously, we're pushing government, and rightly we should be, to come up with something that is going to solve this systemic failure that we is now sort of uncovering.
When are you going to meet them again? Have they given you a sort of time frame?
We did ask for that, and I did push for it in the meeting, but it's not something that we had set in stone, but it's something that we will be following up with.
I mean, Kate, can you imagine what it must be like living in a building where, the risk, there could be a risk of fire?
This has happened to my friends in London.
And, of course, financially, it must be very scary not to know what's going to happen in the future. But day to day, sleeping in these buildings...
Yeah, sleeping in the building and knowing also that you can't move because you can't sell it, and it's extremely difficult to move. My friend had a 6-month wrangle with mortgage and the building owners, and it was timber cladding, so
not covered by the fund?
No, so they were able to eventually move, but they had a 6-month period of huge amount of stress. And it's just when everyone, I mean, particularly in London and particularly in Manchester as well, it's expensive. Those flats looked very nice. They do tend to be on some pretty expensive flats. So my natural feeling is that the people who built them, the companies behind these luxury flat developments,
the majority of people are first-time buyers in flats because you can't afford a house. You buy something that is cheaper, that is affordable. You put everything into it. You scrape, you save, you borrow from your parents. And then to be told you have to foot a bill that is the same price as your deposit. Yeah. Where do we get the money from to do this?
There's also a more general point here about leasehold. I've got constituents who have been ripped off as part of leaseholding by complicated contracts. On page 97 of it, it says something.
And this goes back to the freeholder point. They're very happy to collect ground rent from us. They're very happy to collect subletting fees from us. But there's a denial of responsibility that the buildings need remediating.
And you're absolutely right, I think, in my view. This is not maintenance and repair. So they can't say to a leaseholder, this is maintenance and repair when there's something fundamentally wrong with the building.
My building would have to be ripped down. From the reports I've seen and read, it's an 8.2 to 10 million bill to have it remediated. You'd be better off ripping it down and starting again.
Alex, on that, thank you very much for coming in. We're going to return to the Commons. I know we haven't actually been there, but we saw a picture of it.